This video continues our discussion of costs that may prevent a property system from maximizing aggregate wealth. For the first part, see the link above. Another potential cost of a property system is what's known as rent-seeking behavior, an attempt to capture a super-competitive return, an uncompensated benefit, an attempt to capture wealth without creating new wealth. And so an example that commonly gets used to illustrate the idea of rent-seeking is, suppose you have a river that runs through a property owner's land and boats navigate the river freely. And the property owner one day decides, what would be nice is if I can install a chain across the river that I can raise or lower depending on whether the people in the boats pay me a fee for letting them go through. Now, the creation of the chain is in no way productive. There's no improvement to the land. It's just a charge to people for something that was once free. And the resulting harms are those associated with monopolies. On the one hand, there's a transfer of wealth from one party to the monopolist, and the person subject to the monopoly pricing having to pay a price higher than what was available before, absent property rights in the hypothetical, but in the monopoly setting, a higher price than what would be the case with a price set by the market in a competitive setting. And that's just a straightforward transfer of wealth from one party to another. But note that if the ship captain pays the price, the economic activity of goods flowing through the river continues. We still may have a distributive justice objection to the transfer of wealth from one party to the other, but there is still utilization of resources. But the other problem of monopoly is lost economic activity. So some ships are going to pay the property owner the price of passage, but that price is going to be too high for others. And so that is economic activity that simply doesn't happen. And that is sometimes referred to as the deadweight cost of monopoly. It is wealth that simply does not exist because of the existence of the monopoly, or in this case, of the rents collected by the property owner with a chain. It's also worth noting that rent-seeking behavior is unproductive. I mentioned before that building the chain across the river did not produce any new kind of wealth, and we can think of other kinds of rent-seeking behavior, for example, the lobbying of government for things like subsidies or things like monopoly franchises. We can imagine the farmers of the hypothetical lobbying government for the right to put chains up across rivers, and the captains of this hypothetical similarly lobbying government for declarations that rivers are navigable waters that cannot be blocked by anyone's property rights. And this kind of activity of lobbying the government for a policy decision in one direction or another is not in and of itself a wealth-generating activity. As we discussed in an earlier video, one of the potential advantages of property rights is that they allow the internalization of certain externalities. They force the property owner to consider the effect of future actions upon the value or productivity of the piece of property. So a property owner bears the consequences of congestion and therefore will manage their property in a way to avoid the consequences of the so-called tragedy of the commons. Likewise, they have an incentive to make investments in the productivity of their property because they are the ones who get to capture the increase in value. But property rights will leave other externalities uninternalized and may even exacerbate the problem. So, for example, perhaps property rights incentivize our hypothetical pasture owner to build an irrigation system. Great. But maybe doing so depletes an underground aquifer that supplies drinking water to a nearby town, creating a resource issue where none existed before. So note that property rights in one area may exacerbate a tragedy of the commons in another. Or maybe our hypothetical farmer sells to an entrepreneur who builds a factory, and that factory pollutes the air in a way that harms people living nearby. If the consequences of these harms are external to the property owner's thinking, the result may be a decrease in overall social welfare. Now, of course, there are a range of mechanisms for managing these issues in the real world, ranging from deals, but keeping in mind the problem of transaction costs, or nuisance suits, or regulations. But the point here is simply that the problem of externality is another way that the potential benefits of property rights may go unrealized in practice. And this leads to a general point in conclusion, which is that using property rights to manage resources has trade-offs, and property law reflects these trade-offs in its doctrines. Identifying and understanding these trade-offs and accommodations is useful, whether you're a student studying the property system, a lawyer navigating it on behalf of their client, an activist challenging its distributions of wealth and power, or a reformer seeking to improve it. But, I'm an academic, so of course I'd believe something like that. Thanks for listening.